There are some losses so deep they change what a person is willing to become. There are some wrongs so terrible that justice stops being about courts and starts being about survival. In Wyoming's mountain country, they whisper about Merren Cade, a woman who lost everything when her family was burned out over land. She vanished into the wilderness, and most figured she'd died up there. Then 10 men rode in with rifles, laughing about hunting her down. 3 weeks later, a trapper found 10 skulls arranged in a ring, 10 rifles laid out neat, and Merren sitting calm in the middle, eating cornbread like it was any other morning. What happened in those woods? Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow I've got something that'll stay with you. 5 years before the skull ring appeared in that clearing, Merren Cade stood in her kitchen, watching the morning sun paint the Bitterroot Range gold and purple. She was 32 years old then, with strong hands that knew the feel of bread dough and rifle steel equally well. Her hair, dark as creek water in shadow, hung in a braid down her back. She wore a simple cotton dress beneath a worn apron, and her feet were bare against the smooth plank floor her husband Owen had laid 3 summers prior. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Outside, chickens complained about their morning routine, and somewhere in the barn, their milk cow lowed soft and patient. It was the kind of morning that made a person grateful for the simple fact of being alive. "Mama, Thomas is hogging the wash basin again," her daughter Lily called from the loft. The girl was 11, all elbows and opinions, with her father's steady grey eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. "Am not," Thomas shouted back. At 8 years old, he considered himself too grown for his sister's teasing, though he still slept with the wooden horse his father had carved him 2 winters back. Merren smiled despite herself. "Both of you get yourselves decent and down here. Your father will be in soon, and breakfast won't wait on squabbling." She heard them moving above, the familiar creaks and thumps of her children navigating the morning. The loft had been Owen's idea. Give the children their own space as they grew, he'd said. He'd built it careful and sturdy, like everything else he touched. The man had a gift for making things last. Through the window she could see him now, walking up from the lower pasture where he'd been checking the fence line. Owen Cade was a tall man, lean from work but strong in the way that comes from years of honest labor. He moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin and his own land. When he saw her watching, he raised one hand in greeting, and even from this distance she could see his smile. They'd met 12 years ago at a barn dance in the settlement that would eventually become the town of Bridger's Fork. She'd been 20, fresh from helping her father trap the high country all winter. Owen had been 23, newly arrived from Missouri with plans to homestead and a determination that impressed even her skeptical father. He'd asked her to dance, and she'd said yes, because his hands looked capable and his eyes looked kind. She'd been right about both. The land they'd claimed sat in a valley between 2 ridges, with a creek running cold and clear along the southern boundary. It wasn't easy country, nothing up here was, but it was good country. The soil was rich where you could work it, and the timber grew thick and straight. They'd built the cabin together that first summer, her holding boards while he drove nails. Both of them sunburned and exhausted and happier than either had any right to be. Owen came through the door now, bringing the smell of pine and morning air with him. "Fence is holding," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "But we'll need to reinforce the northwest corner before winter." "Saw where something's been testing it. Bear?" Merren asked, pouring him coffee. "Most likely. Big one from the marks." He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, then glanced toward the loft. "Children still breathing up there?" "Last I checked, though they're practicing their disagreements." Owen's laugh was quiet, the kind that lived mostly in his eyes. "Good. Means they're healthy." Lily and Thomas clattered down the ladder then, their argument apparently resolved or at least postponed. They settled at the table with the unconscious ease of routine, Thomas reaching for the cornbread before Lily smacked his hand away. "Grace first," Merren said, and they all bowed their heads while Owen spoke a simple prayer over the food and the day ahead. It was a small moment, unremarkable in its ordinariness. But Merren would remember it later with a clarity that hurt. The four of them together in the morning light, safe and whole and unaware of how precious that safety was. After breakfast, Owen and Thomas headed out to work on the fence, while Lily helped Merren with the washing. The girl had a quick mind and curious nature, always asking questions about why things worked the way they did. Today, she wanted to know about the mountains, about the high country her mother had trapped with her grandfather. Is it true you can walk for days without seeing another soul up there? Lily asked, scrubbing at a shirt with more enthusiasm than technique. It's true, Merren said. The high country is different from down here. It's wild in a way that demands respect. My father taught me to read the land, to understand what it was telling me. Weather signs in the clouds, game trails in the snow, which plants you could eat and which would kill you. Will you teach me someday? Merren looked at her daughter, seeing the genuine interest in those grey eyes. I will, she promised. When you're a bit older, we'll go up together. But you have to understand, the wilderness isn't cruel, but it's honest. It won't forgive carelessness or foolishness. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of washing and wringing as natural as breathing. This was the life Merren had chosen, had built with her own hands and heart. The work was hard, the winters were harder, but there was a deep satisfaction in it. They were beholden to no one but themselves and the land, and that freedom was worth every callous and every ache. But freedom, as Merren would learn, was something other men could covet and resent. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday in early autumn, when a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking their valley. He sat his horse for a long while just watching, before turning and disappearing back the way he'd come. Owen saw him and said nothing, but Merren noticed how his hand rested on his rifle a bit longer that evening. 3 days later, another rider came, this time right up to their cabin. He was a young man, well dressed in a way that marked him as townfolk, with papers in his saddlebag and an apologetic expression on his face. Mr. Cade, Mrs. Cade, he said, dismounting carefully. My name is Harold Vance. I'm a land agent, working for Mr. Dalton Greer. I'm afraid there's been some confusion regarding the property you're occupying. Owen's face went still in the way Merren had learned. Meant he was working hard to keep his temper. There's no confusion, he said quietly. We filed our claim 6 years ago, proved up after 5 years, got our patent from the land office in Cheyenne. This land is ours, legal and proper. Vance shifted uncomfortably. Yes, well, Mr. Greer has documents indicating that this valley was part of a larger parcel granted to his father by the territorial government. Prior to the Homestead Act, he's been very patient. But he's now prepared to assert his legal claim. His claim is a lie, Owen said, and there was iron in his voice now. I saw those territorial grants. They covered the eastern valleys, not this one. This is public domain land that we claimed fair and square. I'm just delivering the message, Mr. Cade. Mr. Greer would like to discuss this matter with you. Perhaps an arrangement could be reached. Tell Mr. Greer he's welcome to discuss it, Owen said. But he'd better bring his deed and a surveyor, because I've got mine and I know where my boundaries lie. Vance left, looking relieved to be going, and Merren watched him disappear toward town, with a cold feeling settling in her stomach. She knew about Dalton Greer, though they'd never met. Everyone in the territory knew about him, a man who'd come west with his father's money and his own ambitions, buying up land and cattle until he controlled most of the good grazing country within 50 miles. He wasn't the kind of man who accepted being told no. We'll fight this, Owen said that evening, after the children were asleep. They sat at the table, his hand covering hers. We've got the law on our side. The law is only as good as the men who enforce it, Merren said quietly. And Greer has money enough to buy any judge or sheriff between here and Denver. You think I should just give up? Hand over everything we've built? I think we should be prepared for this to get ugly. She was right, though even she didn't understand how ugly it would become. Over the next months, the pressure mounted slowly but inexorably. Greer filed his counterclaim in the county seat, backed by lawyers who knew how to make questionable documents look legitimate. Owen hired a lawyer of his own, a young man from Cheyenne with more principles than experience, and traveled to the county seat twice to argue their case. Meanwhile, other homesteaders in the valley began receiving similar visits. The Johansson family, who lived 3 miles east, sold out within a month. The Weavers held on longer, but finally left after their barn burned down one night, an accident, the sheriff ruled. Though everyone knew better, Sheriff Talmadge was a weak man who'd held his position through the simple expedient of not making waves. He was nearing 60, soft around the middle, with watery blue eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. He'd come to the Cade homestead once, ostensibly to inquire about Owen's claim, but really to suggest that maybe it would be easier for everyone if the Cades just accepted Greer's offer to buy them out. "It's a fair price," Talmadge said, standing in their yard with his hat in his hands. "More than fair, considering the legal questions." "There are no legal questions," Owen said. "Just a rich man trying to steal what isn't his." "Now, Owen, that's not how Mr. Greer sees it. I don't care how Mr. Greer sees it. This is my land, and I'm staying." Talmadge left, shaking his head, and 2 weeks later Owen's lawyer sent word that the judge had ruled in Greer's favor. The decision made no legal sense. It ignored clear precedent and the Federal Land Office's own records, but it stood nonetheless. Owen filed an appeal, but that would take months, maybe years. And everyone knew appeals rarely succeeded when local judges were involved. Through it all, Merren kept the household running, kept the children fed and educated, and as sheltered from the worry as possible. But she also began preparing in ways Owen didn't discuss with him. She cleaned and oiled her rifle, checked her ammunition, and started teaching Lily more advanced tracking skills when they went to gather herbs. She showed Thomas how to move quietly through the forest, how to read sign, how to disappear into the landscape when necessary. "You think it'll come to that?" Owen asked one evening, watching her check the rifle's action. "I think we should be ready for anything," she said. November came cold and early that year. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, turning the valley into a landscape of white and shadow. Merren was in the high country that day, gathering the last of the medicinal plants she could find before winter locked everything down. It was something she did every year, building up stores of feverfew and yarrow and willow bark against the ailments winter would bring. She was 3 miles from the cabin, working her way through a stand of aspen, when she saw the smoke. It rose black and thick against the grey sky, coming from exactly where her home should be. For a moment, Merren stood frozen, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were telling her. Then she was running, crashing through brush and deadfall with no thought for stealth or safety, her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. She ran for 20 minutes, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, until she broke through the tree line above the cabin and saw what the smoke meant. The cabin was fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the air. The heat was so intense she could feel it from 100 yards away. The barn was already collapsed, just burning timbers. Their livestock, she could see the bodies of the chickens scattered in the yard, and something larger that might have been the cow, and there in front of the cabin, 3 shapes that made her legs go weak and her vision narrow to a dark tunnel. Owen lay face down near the door, his shirt dark with blood. Thomas was beside him, small and still. Lily was sprawled near the well, as if she'd been running toward it when she fell. Merren's scream was a sound she didn't recognize as human, torn from somewhere so deep inside her that it left her empty. She stumbled down the slope, falling twice, her vision blurred with tears and smoke, until she reached them. Owen's eyes were open, but saw nothing. There was a bullet hole in his back, and his hand was outstretched toward Thomas, as if he'd been trying to reach him. Thomas had been shot as well, and from the defensive wounds on his small arms, he'd tried to fight. Lily had made it furthest, nearly to the well, but there was so much blood, and her grey eyes stared up at the sky without seeing it. Merren knelt in the dirt between them, touching each cold face, and something inside her shattered so completely that the pieces would never fit back together the same way. She stayed there as the cabin burned behind her, as the snow began to fall harder, as the light faded from the sky. She stayed there until she was kneeling in darkness, with only the dying glow of the fire to see by. Eventually, she heard horses, men's voices rough and careless. "Should be enough to do it," someone said. "No court's gonna worry about a claim on a burned-out homestead." "You sure they were all inside?" another voice asked. "Saw the man and both kids. Wife must have been in there too. Either way, Greer gets his valley." Laughter then, and the sound of horses moving away. Merren stayed where she was, her hands resting on her dead children, and felt the last part of her old self die. What remained was something else entirely, something cold and patient and absolutely without mercy. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she gathered what she could salvage: her rifle and ammunition from the tool shed that hadn't burned, a hunting knife, winter clothes from the root cellar. She found Owen's pocket watch in the dirt near his body, the crystal cracked, but the mechanism still working. It had stopped at 2:47, the moment her family had died. As the sky began to lighten, she dug graves on the ridge above the cabin, using a shovel with a burned handle and her bare hands when that broke. The ground was starting to freeze, and her fingers bled, but she didn't stop until she'd made places for all three of them. She wrapped them in what cloth she could find and lowered them into the earth with a gentleness that contrasted with the fury building in her chest. She spoke no words over them. There were no words adequate to the loss, no prayer that could reach across the divide between living and dead. Instead, she made them a promise in the silence of her heart. What had been done to them would be answered. Justice would come one way or another, regardless of courts or sheriffs or rich men who thought themselves above consequences. When the graves were filled and marked with stones, Merren Cade stood for a long moment, looking at her destroyed life. Then she turned her back on it all and walked into the wilderness, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow for anyone to follow. She did not look back. The high country swallowed Merren Cade the way water accepts a stone, completely and without comment. She walked through the November snow with no destination in mind, only the need to put distance between herself and what lay behind. Her feet found game trails by instinct, paths her father had taught her to recognize decades ago when she was younger than Lily had been. Lily, Thomas, Owen. Their names were knives that cut deeper each time her mind touched them, so she learned quickly to think around them, to hold her consciousness away from that raw wound. Instead, she focused on the immediate demands of survival. Find shelter, find food, find water, stay warm, keep moving. 3 days after leaving the burned homestead, she found a cave tucked into a limestone cliff face, hidden behind a screen of spruce branches. It was shallow but dry, with a narrow opening that would be easy to defend and hard to spot. She'd passed it twice before recognizing the subtle signs her father had taught her to see, the way snow didn't quite accumulate in one spot, the odd angle of certain branches. Inside, the cave smelled of stone and old bear, but the bear was long gone. Merren cleared out the ancient scat and bones, then gathered deadfall and pine needles to make a bed against the back wall. She built a small fire near the entrance, positioned so the smoke would dissipate before it became visible, and sat watching the flames with eyes that saw nothing. The pocket watch ticked against her chest, hung on a leather cord, still stopped at 2:47. She tried to wind it once, and found she couldn't. Keeping it frozen at that moment felt important in a way she couldn't articulate. Time had ended for her family at 2:47 on a November afternoon. Why should it continue for her? But it did continue, stubbornly, and her body made demands that her mind wanted to ignore. Hunger eventually drove her to eat the dried venison she'd salvaged. Thirst sent her to the creek that ran 100 yards below the cave. Cold forced her to maintain the fire and wrap herself in the blankets she'd brought. Survival was automatic, something deeper than thought or will. Her father's training had been thorough. He'd made sure she could live in the wilderness for months, if necessary. Now that knowledge operated without conscious direction, keeping her alive while the part of her that was Merren Cade. Wife and mother howled in the darkness. After a week, she made herself inventory her resources. The rifle had 3 boxes of ammunition, 60 rounds. The knife was good steel, well balanced. She had flint and steel for fire, 2 wool blankets, a tin cup and Owen's watch. Her clothes were adequate for early winter, but would need supplementing before the deep cold came. She spent the next days making the cave livable for a long stay. She built a better fire pit with stones she carried from the creek. She made a frame for smoking meat from saplings and cord salvaged from her pack. She identified the edible plants still available in late autumn and marked their locations in her memory. She found where the deer came to drink and where the elk bedded down in the shelter of the pines. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied during daylight. But the nights were harder. In the darkness, with only the fire between her and the infinite cold, the memories would slip past her defenses. She would see Owen's outstretched hand, Thomas's small defensive wounds, Lily running toward the well as if water could save her. She would hear their voices, Lily asking about the high country, Thomas arguing about the wash basin, Owen thanking her for coffee. These ghost sounds were so vivid that sometimes she turned, expecting to see them there in the firelight. But there was only stone and shadow, and the absolute silence of snow falling in the forest. 20 days after the fire, Merren realized she'd been existing rather than living, hiding rather than acting. She'd run from what had been done to her family, seeking only to escape the pain. But escape was impossible. The pain traveled with her, inside her, part of her now. The question was what she would do with it. She could die here. That would be easy enough. Stop eating or walk out into a blizzard or simply wait for the cold to take her. But something in her refused that option with a stubbornness that surprised her. Owen wouldn't have wanted that. Her children wouldn't have wanted that. And some hard, angry part of herself wasn't ready to give Greer and his men the satisfaction of her death. Or she could live. Not just survive, but actually live. And if she was going to live, she needed to know what had happened. She needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to her family. The decision once made brought a kind of clarity. She would return, not to the burned homestead, but to the edges of civilization. She would watch and listen. She would learn who had given the orders, who had carried them out, who had looked the other way. And then she would decide what justice looked like in a world where courts served the wealthy and sheriffs served themselves. She made her first reconnaissance 2 weeks later, after a new snowfall had covered her tracks. She approached the town of Bridges Fork from the north, moving through the timber above the main road. It was evening when she reached the edge of town, the windows glowing warm against the December darkness. Merren settled into a hiding spot behind a woodpile near the back of the general store, close enough to hear conversations, but far enough to remain invisible. She waited there for 3 hours, listening to men come and go, their voices carrying in the cold air. Most of the talk was ordinary, weather and cattle prices and gossip about neighbors. But eventually, she heard what she'd come for. Heard Greer finally got that Cade property sorted, one man said. Shame about the fire. Shame nothing, another replied. Everyone knew they weren't going to leave voluntary. Greer did what he had to do. You saying he had them killed? I'm saying I'm not surprised they're dead, and neither should you be. This is hard country. People die all the time. Sheriff called it an accident? Course he did. What else was he going to call it? Talmadge knows which side his bread is buttered on. They moved away then, and Merren sat in the darkness behind the woodpile, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. The casual acceptance in those voices, the easy dismissal of murder, it crystallized something in her chest that had been forming since the moment she'd seen the smoke. There would be no justice through law. No court would touch Dalton Greer. No sheriff would investigate him. The system that was supposed to protect people like her family existed only to protect men with money and power, which meant justice, if it came at all, would have to come from somewhere else. Over the next weeks, Merren made regular trips to the edges of town, always moving carefully, always watching and listening. She learned that Greer had immediately filed new claims on the Cade property and 3 other burned-out homesteads. She learned that Sheriff Talmadge had investigated for exactly 1 day before ruling all the fires accidental. She learned that most of the men who worked for Greer were the same ones who'd been with him for years. Tough men who asked no questions and did what they were told. She also learned something that made her blood run cold. She was presumed dead. The story in town was that the entire Cade family had perished in the fire, their bodies consumed in the blaze. Only Owen's body had been recovered, the gossip said, and he'd been buried in the town cemetery with a marker that listed all 4 names. Merren didn't know whether to laugh or weep at this. They'd buried her while she still breathed. They'd erased her from the world, as if she'd never existed. In a way, they were right. The Merren Cade who'd baked bread and raised children was dead. What remained was something they hadn't planned for, something they couldn't control or predict, a ghost who could think and plan and wait. She made one last trip to the burned homestead before winter truly set in. The snow had drifted deep around the collapsed timbers, and someone had trampled through the site, probably Greer's men surveying their acquisition. The graves on the ridge were marked now with a simple wooden cross someone had erected. It bore all 4 names, including hers. Merren stood there for a long time, looking at her own grave marker. Then she removed Owen's pocket watch from around her neck and placed it carefully on the snow at the base of the cross. She couldn't keep carrying their deaths against her heart. The watch belonged here with them, but she made them another promise before she left. Their deaths would be answered. She didn't know how yet or when, but she knew it with the certainty of bone and blood. The men who had done this would pay. Greer would pay. And if the law wouldn't deliver justice, she would. The walk back to her cave took most of the day. By the time she arrived, a heavy snow was falling, the kind that would last through the night and into the next day. Merren built up her fire and sat watching the flames, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a cloak. She was no longer a homesteader's wife or a mother or a member of civilized society. Those identities had burned with her family. What she was now had no name yet, no clear shape. But it was patient, and it was angry, and it would not forget. The wilderness had swallowed her, yes, but it had also transformed her into something that belonged there. Something wild and dangerous in the way that wounded animals are dangerous. Not from malice, but from the simple need to survive and the inability to forget what had been done. That winter, while snow buried the mountains and the valley below went about its business, Merren Cade learned to be alone with her grief and her rage. She learned to let them coexist inside her without being consumed by either. She learned to keep her mind sharp and her skills honed because she understood now that this wasn't temporary. This was her life now, or what remained of it. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt, and the passes would open, and men would move through the mountains again. When they did, she would be ready. She would be watching. And when the time came, and she believed absolutely that it would come, she would act, for now she simply endured. The cave was cold, and the nights were long, and the loneliness was a physical ache. But she'd survived worse. She'd survived losing everything that mattered. This was just learning to live with that loss, to carry it without letting it crush her. She could do that. She was her father's daughter after all. He'd taught her to survive in country that killed the unprepared. He'd taught her to read the land and trust her instincts and never, ever give up. She wouldn't give up. She would survive this winter and the next, and however many it took. And someday, when circumstances aligned and opportunity presented itself, justice would come to the men who'd thought they could burn away a family and walk away unpunished. Merren Cade was dead, buried under a cross with her family. But something else had been born in that moment of loss, something patient and purposeful and absolutely without mercy. That thing had no name yet, but the mountains knew it was there. The winter knew, and eventually the men responsible would know too. She fed the fire and wrapped herself in her blankets, and in the darkness of the cave she began to plan. 2 years passed in the high country, and Merren learned what it meant to become part of the landscape rather than merely living in it. The cave she'd found that first winter became home in a way the cabin had never quite been. not because it was comfortable, but because it demanded nothing of her except survival. There were no neighbors to smile at, no social obligations to fulfill, no pretense of civilization to maintain. There was only the mountain and the forest, and the endless cycle of seasons. She marked time now by the practical measures of wilderness living, when the elk moved to lower ground, when the first berries ripened, when the aspens turned gold. The dates and months that had once organized her life meant nothing here. There was only now, today, this moment of finding food, or staying warm or remaining hidden. The first spring after the fire, she'd improved her shelter significantly. She'd built a frame of saplings and stretched hides over it, creating a second layer of protection against the wind. She'd lined the floor with pine boughs and changed them regularly. She'd established multiple supply caches in different locations so that if one was discovered or destroyed, she wouldn't lose everything. Her father had taught her this. Never keep all your resources in one place. She hunted with careful efficiency, taking only what she needed and using every part of what she killed. Deer in the autumn, rabbit and grouse through the winter, fish from the creek when the ice broke. She gathered wild onions and camas root, picked berries in late summer, harvested pine nuts in the fall. The forest provided if you knew how to read it and had the patience to work with its rhythms rather than against them. Her body changed with the work and the life. She grew leaner, harder, all excess stripped away by constant movement and sparse meals. Her hands developed new calluses from different work, from skinning game and working hides and climbing rocks. Her hearing sharpened, attuned now to the subtle sounds that indicated danger or opportunity. She learned to move silently through underbrush that would betray most people, learned to become invisible by understanding how to use shadow and stillness. The most profound change, though, was in how she thought. The patterns of civilization, worry about what others thought, concern for appearance, the constant noise of social interaction, all of that fell away. What remained was something more direct, more honest. In the wilderness, things were simple. You were hungry or fed, cold or warm, safe or in danger. There was no room for pretense or self-deception. She spoke to herself sometimes, and to the memory of her family, but mostly she learned to live in silence. Days would pass without her making a sound beyond what was necessary. The crack of breaking branches for kindling, the splash of washing in the creek. Her voice, when she did use it, sounded strange to her own ears, as if it belonged to someone else. The solitude was both burden and gift. There were times when the loneliness was so intense it felt like drowning, when she would have traded years of her life for 5 minutes of human conversation. But there were also times when the solitude became a kind of peace, when she sat watching the sunset paint the mountains, and felt connected to something larger than herself, something that had existed long before her grief and would continue long after. In her second summer, she began expanding her range, moving farther from her primary cave to explore the high ridges and hidden valleys. She found a dozen places where she could shelter if needed, memorized the terrain with the thoroughness her father had demanded. She located every source of water, every game trail, every pass that would be navigable in bad weather. One day in late July, she was following a ridgeline when she spotted movement in the valley below. Men on horseback, 3 of them, moving along what had once been a trapper's trail. She dropped into cover instinctively, watching through the screen of a juniper bush. They were Greer's men. She recognized 2 of them from her nighttime observations near town. They rode with the casual arrogance of people who believed they owned everything they could see. One of them had a bottle he was passing around, and their laughter carried up to where Merren crouched. She watched them pass, and continued watching until they disappeared around a bend in the valley. Her heart was pounding, and she realized with some surprise that it wasn't fear. It was anger, yes, but also something else, a kind of anticipation. These were the enemy, the men who worked for the man who destroyed her life. Seeing them reminded her that her grief had a target, that her rage had a purpose. After that, she began watching them deliberately. She learned their patterns, their routes, their habits. She discovered that Greer had established line camps throughout what he now considered his territory, places where his men would spend days or weeks at a time, supposedly watching for rustlers or predators, but mostly just drinking and playing cards. She never got close, never let them see her, but she was there, a shadow watching from the tree line, a presence felt but not seen. Once she found where 3 of them had camped for the night, and she moved through their cold camp the next morning, reading the story of their stay. This one liked whiskey. That one was careless with his ammunition. The third had sat up late by the fire, probably on watch, judging by the pattern of cigarette butts. She took nothing, left no sign of her presence, but she learned. Every observation was filed away in her memory, building a detailed picture of how these men operated, where they were vulnerable, what they feared, because they did fear things. She could see it in how they built their fires large enough to push back the darkness. She could hear it in their jokes about the mountain woman some trappers claimed to have seen. They laughed, but the laughter had an edge to it. The wilderness made them nervous in a way it no longer made her nervous. That was her advantage, she realized. They were visitors here, outsiders who came and went. She belonged here now in a way they never could. This was her territory, and she knew every rock and tree and shadow. They were the ones who were exposed, not her. In the autumn of her 2nd year, something shifted in her approach. She'd been content to simply observe, to gather information without acting. But watching Greer's men swagger through the mountains, treating the land as their personal property, stirred something darker in her chest. She began leaving signs. Nothing obvious, nothing they could point to and say definitively that someone was there. But small things, a stick placed across a trail in a way that wasn't quite natural, a pile of rocks that hadn't been there the day before, the feeling of being watched, which she cultivated by positioning herself where her presence could be sensed if not seen. She knew she was taking a risk. If they realized someone was actively tracking them, they might mount a serious search. But she also knew something they didn't. She'd become so attuned to the forest that she could disappear completely when necessary. She could hear them coming long before they could hear her. She could read their intentions in how they moved and spoke. One evening in October, she watched from a ridge as 2 of Greer's men made camp in a meadow a mile from her main cave. They were clearly nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders, starting at every sound. One of them told the other he'd felt watched all day, that something wasn't right about this place. "It's just the wind," his companion said. But he didn't sound convinced. "No," the first man insisted. "Something's out there. I can feel it." He was right, of course. Merren was 300 yards away, perfectly concealed, watching them through the gathering dusk. She stayed until their fire burned low and they'd climbed into their bedrolls. Then she moved away, silent as smoke, satisfied that she'd planted seeds of doubt in their minds. This became her purpose through that winter, not to attack or confront, but to make them understand that these mountains weren't theirs, that they were being watched, that something in the wilderness was aware of them in a way they couldn't quite understand. She marked her territory the way an animal marks territory, with presence and pressure rather than violence. She wanted them to feel hunted for once, to experience the uncertainty she'd lived with. It was a small revenge, but it sustained her through the cold months, in the depths of winter, when snow locked the high country down completely. She had time to refine her understanding of what she was doing and why. She'd spent 2 years learning to survive, learning to move through the wilderness like a ghost. But survival alone wasn't enough. She needed purpose beyond simply not dying. Her family's graves were somewhere under that snow, marked with a cross that bore her name along with theirs. They deserved more than her survival. They deserved justice, or if justice was impossible, then at least an accounting. The men who'd killed them should know that their actions had consequences, that you couldn't murder a family and walk away unchanged. But she was one woman, alone, with limited resources. A direct confrontation with Greer would be suicide. He had dozens of men, money, influence, and the law on his side. She had only herself, her skills, and the mountains. Yet the mountains were considerable allies, she was beginning to realize. In this terrain, numbers meant less than knowledge. Guns meant less than patience. Wealth meant nothing at all against someone who needed almost nothing to survive. The idea that would eventually lead to the skull ring began forming in her mind that winter, though she didn't recognize it yet. It started with a simple question. What did Greer and his men fear? Not the law, certainly, not social consequences, but perhaps they feared the unknown, the wilderness, the things that moved in darkness beyond their campfires. People told stories about the high country, about things seen and unseen, about trappers who disappeared, about the mountain having its own justice. Most of it was nonsense, of course, but the fear was real. She'd felt it herself as a child, that primal unease that came from being in a place where humans were not the dominant force. What if she became the thing they feared? Not through violence, at least not initially, but through presence and mystery? What if the legend of the mountain woman became something real enough to haunt them? It was a strange thought, almost whimsical, but it lodged in her mind and grew through the winter months. She had plenty of time to think, after all, with nothing but the howl of wind and the crack of cold timbers to interrupt her reflections. By the time spring came again, she'd made certain decisions. She would continue to watch and learn, but she would also begin to cultivate her legend deliberately. She would let herself be glimpsed occasionally, just enough to confirm that the stories were true. She would leave signs that couldn't be explained away as natural phenomena. She would make Greer's men understand that something in these mountains remembered what they'd done. It wasn't a complete plan, and it wasn't revenge exactly. But it was something, a direction, a purpose beyond simple survival. And in the emptiness where her old life had been, purpose was everything. She emerged from her cave on a morning in late March, when the snow was beginning to retreat from the lower elevations. The sun was warm on her face, and she could hear water running under the ice in the creek below. The world was coming back to life, and so, in a strange way, was she. Merren Cade, the homesteader's wife, was still dead and buried. But something else had been born in her place, something shaped by loss and solitude and the hard lessons of wilderness survival. This new thing had no name yet, but it was patient and purposeful and absolutely committed to making sure that what had been done to her family would not be forgotten. She stood on the ridge above her cave, looking out over the mountains that had become her home and her fortress, and she felt ready for whatever came next. The men who destroyed her life thought they'd gotten away with it. They thought she was dead and buried and no longer a concern. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about a lot of things, and eventually they would learn just how wrong they'd been. The third spring brought a change in Merren's approach. Where before she'd been content to observe from a distance, she now moved closer, took more risks, gathered information with a specific purpose in mind. She'd spent 2 years learning to survive, and 1 year learning the patterns of Greer's operation. Now it was time to understand the men themselves, not just as a collective threat, but as individuals with habits and weaknesses. She started keeping a journal of sorts, using a small notebook she'd taken from a trapper's abandoned camp. In it, she recorded everything she observed about Greer's men, their names, their faces, their patterns of movement. She sketched rough maps of their regular routes and noted the timing of their patrols. She documented which camps they favored and which trails they avoided. More importantly, she began to identify the specific men who'd been present the day her family died. This required careful observation and considerable patience. She had to get close enough to overhear conversations, to catch fragments of stories told around campfires. She had to watch how they interacted with each other, looking for the bonds that formed between men who'd shared violence. By midsummer, she'd identified 5 of them with certainty. There was Sutton, Greer's foreman, a hard man in his 40s, with pale eyes and a mouth like a knife cut. He wore a distinctive knife on his belt, and Merren had heard him boast about using it to light up that homestead real good. The words had been spoken casually, without remorse, as if burning a family alive was no different from lighting a campfire. There was Pike, younger and mean in a different way, the kind of cruel that enjoyed causing pain. He wore a rattlesnake hatband and had a habit of spitting when he talked. She'd heard him laugh about the sound the cabin had made when it collapsed. about how the screaming had stopped after a few minutes. The others she knew less well, Deacon, Farley, and a man called Dutch, but she'd seen them all together at one campfire, drunk and reminiscing about that Cade business. They'd congratulated each other on a job well done, on how clean it had been, how no one in town had questioned it for a moment, listening to them. Merren had felt something cold and absolutely still settle in her chest. These weren't men forced into violence by circumstance. They weren't desperate or afraid. They'd murdered her family for wages and never lost a night's sleep over it. They were still here, still working for Greer, still riding through the mountains as if they had every right to exist. But there were others involved too. She was certain of that. 5 men couldn't have managed the attack alone, not with the efficiency that had been described. There had to be more, and she needed to identify all of them before she could decide what justice looked like. She began taking greater risks to get this information. She would wait until Greer's men made camp, then move in close after dark, close enough to hear their conversations clearly. She learned to approach from downwind, to time her movements with the wind, so any sound she made would be masked. She learned to hold absolutely still for hours at a time, even when insects crawled across her skin or her muscles screamed for relief. One night in August, she was positioned in a draw about 50 yards from a camp where 6 of Greer's men had gathered. They'd been drinking, and as the night wore on, their talk turned to the old days, to jobs they'd done for Greer that never made it into any official record. "Remember that family up in Bitterroot Valley?" one of them said, a man she didn't recognize. "The ones who wouldn't sell?" "The Cades," Sutton said. "That was good work." "Quick and clean. How many were there again?" Another asked. 4, man, woman, 2 kids. Greer wanted them all gone, wanted it to look natural. "So we waited until the woman was away from the cabin. Then we did the job." "Didn't the woman come back?" This from a younger man she'd later learn was named Kelly, probably burned up inside, and we just didn't find the body, Pike said. "Either that or she wandered off and died in the woods. Either way, problem solved." They continued talking, and Merren continued listening, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they'd hear it. By the time they finally turned in for the night, she'd confirmed 4 more names: Kelly, Ransom, Cobb, and a man called Tennessee for reasons no one explained. 9 men now. 9 men who'd had direct involvement in murdering her family. Were there more? She didn't know yet, but 9 was enough to work with. 9 was enough to plan around. She withdrew from the camp with the same care she'd used approaching it, not allowing herself to think about what she'd heard until she was safely away. Then, sitting in the darkness with her back against a pine tree, she let herself feel the full weight of it. These men had killed her children, killed Owen, destroyed everything she'd built, and they'd felt nothing but professional satisfaction about the job. The rage that rose in her was so intense it made her vision darken at the edges. She wanted to go back to that camp right now, wanted to kill them all while they slept, wanted to make them feel even a fraction of what her family had felt. But she forced herself to breathe, to think, to remember that rage without planning was just suicide with extra steps. She was 1 woman against 9 men, and likely more. She had surprise and knowledge of terrain on her side, but they had numbers and weapons and the backing of the wealthiest man in the territory. A direct assault would accomplish nothing except her own death, and that would mean they'd won completely. No. If she was going to do this, she had to be smart. She had to use every advantage she had and create disadvantages for them. She had to make them come to her, on her terms, in her territory. But how? The answer came to her over the next weeks as she continued her surveillance. Greer's men were becoming increasingly nervous about the mountains. The signs she'd been leaving, the glimpses of her that trappers had reported, the general sense of being watched. It was all adding up to a legend that was starting to affect their behavior. They traveled in larger groups now. They built bigger fires. They talked more to fill the silence. They were afraid, even if they wouldn't admit it. And fear, Merren was beginning to understand, could be weaponized just as effectively as a rifle. She began to be more deliberate about being seen. Not clearly, never clearly enough for them to be certain, but in ways that would leave them unsettled. A figure at the tree line that vanished when they looked directly at it. Movement in the shadows just beyond firelight. The sense of eyes watching from the dark. She also started manipulating their environment in subtle ways. She would move their supplies around while they slept, not taking anything, just rearranging things so they'd know someone had been there. She'd leave tracks that appeared and disappeared impossibly. She'd make sounds in the night that didn't quite match any animal they knew. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. She could see it in how jumpy they were getting, how they argued with each other more, how they drank harder to steady their nerves. The mountains that had once seemed like their personal hunting ground were beginning to feel hostile. Uncertain, dangerous in ways they couldn't quite define. In September, she overheard a conversation that told her just how successful her campaign had been. 3 men were camped in a meadow she often watched, and they were discussing whether to continue working for Greer. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong with these mountains," one of them said. "I grew up in rough country, and I've never felt anything like this. It's like the land itself doesn't want us here. It's just the wind and your imagination," another replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "Then explain the things that keep happening. Explain how our camp got rearranged last week when we were all asleep. Explain the tracks that lead right up to our fire, and then just stop." "Maybe it's that woman," the third man said quietly. "The Cade woman. Maybe she didn't die like we thought. That's crazy. She'd have to be living up here for, 3 years now? Nobody could survive that. Her old man did. The stories say he lived in the high country for months at a time. Taught her everything he knew. Maybe she's out there. Maybe she knows what we did." Silence then, and Merren could almost feel their fear through the darkness. They wanted to dismiss it as impossible, but the rational part of their minds was telling them that yes, it was possible. And if it was possible, then they were being hunted by someone who had every reason to want them dead. They broke camp the next morning and left the high country, and Merren watched them go with grim satisfaction. She'd gotten into their heads. She'd made them doubt and fear. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. As autumn advanced and the days grew shorter, she refined her understanding of what she was doing. This wasn't just about revenge, though that was certainly part of it. It was about justice in a place where legal justice was impossible. It was about making sure that men couldn't murder a family and simply move on with their lives unchanged. She thought often about her children during those long autumn nights. Lily would have been 14 now, Thomas 11. What would they think of what she'd become? She didn't know, and that uncertainty troubled her. She'd always tried to be a good mother, to teach them right from wrong, to show them that violence was a last resort. But what was the alternative? Let their killers walk free? Pretend that what happened to them didn't matter? She couldn't do that. She wouldn't do that. She pulled out Owen's pocket watch. She'd retrieved it from their graves that spring and looked at the stopped hands. 2:47, the moment everything ended. The moment everything began. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the watch, to the memory of her family. "I'm sorry for what I'm becoming. But I don't know what else to do." The watch, of course, offered no answer. But somehow, holding it, she felt a sense of rightness about her path. Owen had been a peaceful man, yes, but he'd also been a man who believed in justice. He would have wanted their children's deaths to mean something, to count for something beyond just another tragedy in hard country. Winter came early that year, and with it came news that would change everything. She was near town one evening, close enough to hear men talking outside the saloon, when she heard Greer's name mentioned, along with a new plan. "He's offering bounty," one man said. $100 to the man who brings proof he killed the mountain woman. "If she even exists," another replied. "Oh, she exists all right. Too many men have seen her. Too many things have happened. Greer's had enough. He's putting together a hunting party, 10 men, best trackers and shooters in the territory. They're going up there to end this once and for all." Merren listened to the details, with her heart pounding. 10 men coming for her. Deliberately, with planning and resources. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something else entirely, a dark anticipation. They were finally taking her seriously enough to organize against her. They were coming into her territory on her terms, and when they did, she'd be ready. More than ready. She'd been preparing for this for 3 years, even if she hadn't known it. Now the game would begin in earnest, and only one side would walk out of the mountains alive. As she made her way back to her cave through the early snow, Merren allowed herself a cold smile. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea the town of Bridges Fork buzzed with talk of the hunting party for 2 weeks before they actually rode out. Merren heard it all from her various listening posts, the careful positions she'd established over the years that let her observe without being seen. She learned everything: who was going, what they were bringing, how they planned to conduct the hunt. Dalton Greer himself organized the expedition from his ranch house, though he wouldn't be riding with them. He was past 60 now, soft from years of comfort, more accustomed to giving orders than carrying them out. But he'd put up his own money for this, $100 per man just for going, and $500 more to whoever brought back proof of the mountain woman's death. The reward poster appeared on the front of the general store 3 days before the hunt began. Merren saw it on one of her nighttime forays into town, and she stood in the shadows, reading it with a strange mixture of anger and something almost like pride. Someone had drawn a crude image meant to represent her, a wild-haired woman with feral eyes, more monster than human. The text beneath declared her a danger to all who traveled the high country, a murderess and witch who'd been killing Greer's cattle and terrorizing honest working men. It was all lies, of course. She'd never touched Greer's cattle, never harmed anyone. But lies served Greer's purpose, which was to justify what he was about to do. If she was a monster, then hunting her down was civic duty rather than murder. The 10 men who volunteered were a mix of Greer's regular ranch hands and mercenaries brought in special for the job. Merren made note of each name as she heard it. Sutton, the foreman, would lead them. Pike would go, and Deacon, and 3 others she'd identified from the fire: Kelly, Ransom, and Cobb. The remaining 4 were hired guns, a tracker called Bowman, 2 brothers named Harris and Will, and a man with the improbable name of Tennessee Sam, who supposedly killed a grizzly with a knife once. 10 men against 1 woman. The odds should have been insurmountable. But Merren had advantages they didn't understand and couldn't plan for. She knew every ridge and valley, every cave and water source, every game trail and deadfall. She could move through terrain that would slow them to a crawl. And most importantly, she was fighting for something they couldn't comprehend, not bounty money or employment, but for the memory of her murdered family and the cold. Patient rage that had sustained her through 3 years of solitude, the night before they departed. She was close enough to Greer's ranch to watch them gather in the bunkhouse. Through the window, she could see them drinking and playing cards, their rifles stacked against the wall. They were confident, even celebratory. To them, this was barely more than a hunting trip with better pay than usual. She watched Sutton hold court, explaining how they do it. "We spread out in a line, work our way up the valley. She's got to be holed up somewhere in the high country, probably one of the caves or old trapper shelters. We find her hideout, we smoke her out, we end this. What if she runs?" Someone asked. "Where's she going to run? We've got 10 men and she's got nowhere to go. These mountains might be big, but they're not infinite. We'll run her down like any other varmint." They all laughed at that, and Merren felt her jaw clench. They saw her as prey, as something less than human. That was their first mistake. Their second was thinking that numbers and weapons automatically meant victory. She withdrew from the ranch as quietly as she'd arrived and made her way back to the high country. She had preparations to make, and not much time to make them. The terrain would be her primary weapon, but she needed to maximize every advantage. Over the next 2 days, she worked with focused intensity. She identified 3 primary routes the hunting party might take into the mountains and prepared each one. She didn't set traps. That would be too obvious and too dangerous to any innocent trappers or travelers. Instead, she created false signs that would lead them where she wanted them to go, and she removed signs that would lead them where she didn't want them. She prepared her own fallback positions, places where she could observe without being seen, routes of escape if things went wrong, caches of supplies hidden in case she needed to abandon her main cave. She checked her rifle thoroughly, cleaned and oiled it, counted her ammunition again. 60 rounds. It would have to be enough. On the morning the hunting party rode out of Bridger's Fork, Merren was watching from a ridge 3 miles away. She saw them through the cold dawn air, 10 riders, well-armed and well-supplied, moving with the confidence of men who'd never seriously imagined losing. They had pack horses loaded with food and camping gear, enough to stay out for weeks if necessary. Sutton led them, sitting his horse like he owned the mountains themselves. Behind him came the others, strung out in a loose column, talking and laughing as if this were a social outing. She watched until they disappeared into the mouth of the valley, then began to parallel their course, staying high and keeping them in sight. For the first 3 days, she simply observed. They moved predictably, following the main valley north into the high country. At night they made camp with big fires and loud conversation, their confidence unshaken. She counted their rifles, 10 plus sidearms, and noted how they posted guards, though the guards were more interested in staying warm than actually watching. On the 4th day, she began to make her presence known. Nothing dramatic, just small things. She left tracks across their trail, tracks that appeared suddenly and led nowhere. She moved their picket line during the night, not far, just enough that they'd notice. She made sounds in the darkness beyond their firelight. Not animal sounds, but not quite human either. The effect was subtle, but noticeable. By the morning of the 5th day, their conversation had lost some of its casual confidence. The guards at night were more alert, jumping at every sound. They started to argue about the best route, about whether they should split up or stay together. Sutton held them together through force of personality and threats. "She's one woman," he growled when Cobb suggested maybe they should head back. "We're 10 armed men. Use your head." But doubt had been planted, and Merren carefully nurtured it. On the 6th day, she let herself be seen, briefly at a distance, just a figure among the trees that vanished when they looked directly at it. Half of them claimed to have seen her, half said it was nothing. The argument that followed was heated and exactly what she'd hoped for. That night, one of the Harris brothers took first watch. Merren waited until the others were asleep, then moved closer than she'd ever dared before. She was 30 yards from their fire, hidden behind a deadfall, when she began to make sounds, footsteps that circled their camp, staying just out of sight. Harris woke the others in a panic. "Someone's out there. I heard them walking around us." They all scrambled up, rifles ready, peering into the darkness. Merren held absolutely still, watching them through a gap in the deadfall. They were afraid now. She could see it in how they held their weapons, how they stood back to back, how their voices had gone tight and high. "Show yourself," Sutton shouted into the night. "We know you're there." Merren said nothing, did nothing. After a few minutes, she began to withdraw, making just enough noise that they'd hear her leaving. She wanted them to know she'd been close enough to harm them if she'd wanted to, but had chosen not to. That uncertainty, not knowing her intentions or capabilities, would eat at them more than any direct attack. By morning, the camp was a mess of frayed nerves and short tempers. They'd barely slept, jumping at every sound. Pike wanted to go home. Tennessee Sam said he'd tracked panthers that were less unsettling than this. Even Sutton looked unsure, though he did his best to hide it. "We're not quitting," he declared. "We're going to find her hideout today, and we're going to end this." They packed up and moved deeper into the mountains, following a trail that Merren had carefully prepared for them. She'd made it obvious enough that Bowman, their tracker, would find it easily. She'd created signs of recent passage, broken branches, disturbed earth, even an old campfire that looked like it had been used recently. They followed it like dogs on a scent, their confidence returning now that they had something concrete to track. What they didn't know was that the trail led to a box canyon with no easy exit, a place where the high walls would echo sound in confusing ways and where the shadows were deep even at midday. By the time they realized where they were headed, it was nearly dusk. They made camp in the canyon, posting extra guards, their nerves clearly worn thin by days of psychological pressure. Merren watched from high above, perched on a ledge they'd never think to look at, and felt a cold satisfaction. They'd come hunting her. Now they were learning what it felt like to be hunted. She spent that night moving around the canyon rim, making sounds that echoed strangely off the rocks, sometimes seeming close, sometimes far, never quite identifiable. She didn't sleep. She didn't need to. This was what she'd been preparing for, what 3 years of solitude and rage had built toward. When dawn came gray and cold, she could see the exhaustion in the men below. They'd spent another sleepless night starting at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow. They were strung tight, ready to break. And that's when she decided it was time to take the first one. She'd been waiting for someone to separate from the group, someone careless or confident or simply unlucky. It happened mid-morning, when Cobb wandered away from camp to relieve himself, moving downstream where the canyon wall created a natural privacy screen. Merren moved like water, silent and inevitable. She'd positioned herself for this, anticipating that eventually someone would make exactly this mistake. Cobb never heard her coming, never knew she was there until her arm was around his throat and her knee was in his back. She could have made it slow, could have made him suffer for what he'd done to her family. But that wasn't who she was, not yet, maybe not ever. She made it quick and as merciful as murder could be. His struggles lasted less than 30 seconds, and then he was still. She left his body where it fell, but took his rifle. She carried it 50 yards downstream and propped it carefully against a distinctive rock formation, where the others would eventually find it. Then she withdrew to her high perch and waited. It took them an hour to notice Cobb was missing. Their shouts echoed through the canyon as they searched, growing more frantic as the minutes passed. When they finally found his body, and then his rifle positioned so deliberately, the fear that had been building finally broke through their facade of confidence. "She's playing with us," Pike said, his voice carrying up to where Merren crouched. "She could have killed any of us." "She's playing with us. We need to leave," another voice said. "This isn't worth the money. Nothing's worth this." But Sutton wouldn't hear it. He'd lost control of the situation and knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "We're not running from one woman. We're not going back and telling Greer we failed because we were scared." They argued for another hour, while Merren watched and waited. 9 men now. 9 men who were beginning to understand that they weren't the hunters in this equation. They were the prey. The 9 remaining men broke camp in the canyon with frantic haste, desperate to escape the trap they'd walked into. But the box canyon that had seemed easy enough to enter proved more difficult to leave. The trail they'd followed in was narrow and treacherous, forcing them to move single file with pack horses that had grown skittish from their riders' fear. Merren watched from above as they struggled, making no move to attack. She wanted them out of the canyon, wanted them moving through the high country where she could pick them apart slowly. The psychological damage from Cobb's death was already evident in how they moved, constantly looking over their shoulders, starting at every sound, keeping their rifles ready even when it made walking more difficult. Sutton tried to maintain order, but his authority was fraying. Pike openly questioned his decisions now. The Harris brothers wanted to split off and make their own way back to town. Only the threat of Sutton's considerable physical presence kept the group together, and even that was weakening. They emerged from the canyon at midday and immediately made another mistake. They headed north instead of south, pushing deeper into the high country rather than back towards civilization. Merren realized that Bowman, their tracker, had lost his bearings. The stress and fear had compromised his judgment, and now he was leading them the wrong direction while claiming confidence in his choices. She could have corrected their course, could have left obvious signs pointing them homeward. Instead, she paralleled their movement, letting them walk further into country that would make their eventual retreat even more desperate and difficult. That night, they made camp in a meadow surrounded by thick timber. They built the fire large and bright, sacrificing concealment for the psychological comfort of light. Merren counted 3 guards posted, an improvement in their discipline, but it didn't matter. She had no intention of attacking their camp directly. Instead, she waited until the early hours of morning, when exhaustion made even the guards' attention wander. Then she moved to where they'd picketed their horses and began work on the one weapon against her that she truly feared, their ability to move faster than she could over long distances. She didn't stampede the horses or harm them. She simply cut the picket line and opened a clear path toward water and good grazing a half-mile away. The horses, sensing an opportunity, wandered off gradually through the pre-dawn darkness. By the time the camp stirred to life, their mounts were scattered across a half-mile of forest, and two of the pack horses had disappeared entirely. The cursing and recriminations that followed were music to Merren's ears. It took them until mid-morning to round up most of the horses, and they never did find the two pack horses. With those animals went a significant portion of their food supplies and ammunition. "This is her," Deacon said, his voice loud enough to carry to where Merren crouched 100 yards away. "She's been in our camp. While we slept, she was right here." The thought of how close she'd been, how vulnerable they'd been, broke something in Ransom. "I'm done," he announced. "I'm taking my horse and I'm heading back. The rest of you can do what you want. You leave now, you don't get paid," Sutton said. "I don't care about the money anymore. I care about staying alive." But when Ransom tried to mount his horse, Sutton pulled him off and hit him hard enough to drop him to the ground. "Nobody leaves. We're in this together, and we're going to finish it together." The brutality of it shocked the others into submission, but Merren could see that Sutton had just made things worse. Fear was now mixing with resentment, and the group's cohesion was dissolving. They were 9 men, united only by Sutton's threats and their own terror, and that kind of unity wouldn't hold long. They moved out at noon, heading west now, still the wrong direction. But Merren didn't care. Every mile they traveled was another mile they'd have to travel back, another drain on their dwindling resources. Another opportunity for her to work on their minds and morale. She took the second man that afternoon. Kelly had always been the youngest and least experienced of the group. He rode near the back of the column, constantly glancing behind him, his rifle clutched so tight his knuckles were white. When they stopped to water the horses at a creek, he dismounted and moved upstream to fill his canteen, separating himself from the group by 30 yards of rushing water. Merren was already there, hidden in the thick brush along the bank. She'd anticipated someone would make exactly this mistake, and she'd been positioned for an hour, waiting. When Kelly knelt at the water's edge, she moved. Like with Cobb, she made it quick. There was no pleasure in it, no satisfaction, only a cold necessity. Kelly had been there when her family died, had taken Greer's money to murder children. This was justice, or as close to justice as she would ever get. She dragged his body into the brush, took his rifle and ammunition, and left them positioned on a rock beside the creek, where they'd be immediately visible. Then she withdrew into the forest and waited for the discovery. The screaming started 5 minutes later when Tennessee Sam went looking for Kelly. "He's dead." "She got Kelly." "She got him right under our noses." The remaining 8 men bunched together like cattle sensing wolves, their rifles pointing in every direction at once. Merren watched their panic with grim satisfaction. They were completely undone now, jumping at shadows, seeing threats everywhere. "We need to leave," Pike said, and this time no one disagreed. Even Sutton seemed to recognize that staying in the high country was suicide. "We head back now, we move fast and we don't stop." But which way was back? Bowman admitted he was no longer certain of their position. The mountains looked different from every direction, and days of fear and poor sleep had clouded his judgment. They argued for 10 minutes about which trail to take, before finally choosing one, essentially at random. Merren knew the trail they'd chosen would take them north and west, deeper into rough country. She also knew there was a fallen tree across that trail a mile ahead, forcing a detour that would cost them hours. She'd noted it days ago and filed it away for exactly this kind of situation. She followed at a distance as they struggled through increasingly difficult terrain. Their horses were exhausted, their food was running low, and the altitude was beginning to affect some of them. What had started as a confident hunting party was now a desperate scramble for survival. That night, they made camp without fire, reasoning that darkness would hide them better than light. It was a reasonable tactical decision, but psychologically devastating. Sitting in complete darkness, hearing every sound in the forest, amplified by fear. They came apart at the seams. Arguments broke out over everything. Who was supposed to be watching? How they'd gotten so lost, whose fault it was that Kelly and Cobb were dead. Sutton tried to maintain control, but his authority was gone. When he ordered Pike to take first watch, Pike told him to do it himself. "You led us up here," Pike said. "You promised easy money for easy work. Now 2 men are dead and we're lost in the mountains with that thing out there hunting us. She's not a thing. She's just a woman. She's killed 2 of us without making a sound. She's been in our camps while we slept. She's led us around like children. Whatever she is, she's not just a woman." The conversation devolved into accusations and recriminations. Merren listened from the darkness 30 yards away, close enough to hear every word. And she understood that her psychological campaign had worked even better than she'd hoped. They didn't see her as human anymore. They saw her as something supernatural, something the mountains had created to punish them, which was exactly what she needed them to believe. She spent that night moving around their camp, deliberately making just enough noise to keep them alert, but never showing herself. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, every sound that might have been footsteps kept them rigid with fear. By dawn they looked like ghosts themselves, pale, hollow-eyed, barely able to function. When they mounted up to leave, she saw that Ransom and Deacon were both weaving in their saddles, exhausted beyond coherent thought. The others weren't much better. They'd been in the mountains for 10 days now, and the last 3 had aged them years. She let them ride for 2 hours before taking the 3rd man. Tennessee, Sam made the fatal mistake of dropping back to adjust his saddle rigging. The trail had narrowed to single file through a dense section of forest, and the others pulled ahead without noticing he'd stopped. It gave Merren a window of perhaps 2 minutes, and that was all she needed. Sam never saw her coming. One moment he was bent over his saddle, the next his consciousness was fading into darkness. His horse spooked and bolted forward, riderless, causing confusion and panic among the remaining riders. By the time they backtracked to find him, Merren had positioned his rifle against a tree, the same as the others. The message was clear: "I could kill any of you any time I want. You're only alive because I'm allowing it." 7 men remained now, and the breaking point had arrived. When they found Sam's body and his deliberately placed rifle, Pike simply sat down on the ground and refused to move. "I'm done," he said. "Kill me if you want, but I'm not going another step. This is over." 2 of the others, Will and Bowman, immediately agreed. They were finished with Sutton's leadership, finished with trying to hunt something that couldn't be hunted. Sutton looked at the faces of his remaining men and saw his authority completely dissolved. He was a foreman without workers, a leader without followers. "Fine," he finally said. "We split up. Those who want to go back, go back. I'm going to find her and finish this." "You're crazy," Pike said. "Maybe, but I'm not going back to Greer and telling him I ran from a woman. Anyone who wants to come with me, come. The rest of you get out of my sight." In the end, only Ransom stayed with Sutton, either from loyalty or from being too exhausted to think clearly. The other 5 grouped together, determining to head back the way they'd come, or at least what they thought was the way they'd come. Merren watched from cover as the 2 groups parted ways. The larger group headed south and east, the right general direction, even if they didn't know it. Sutton and Ransom headed north and west, still convinced her hideout was up in the highest country. She had to make a choice: follow the 5 or follow the 2. The 5 were giving up, heading home. The 2 were still committed to killing her. The choice was obvious. She let the 5 go and turned her attention to Sutton and Ransom, the last men standing between her and the justice she'd spent 3 years preparing for. They wanted to find her hideout. She'd make sure they did, just not in the way they expected. The end game was beginning. And when it was over, there would be 10 rifles and 10 skulls arranged in a ring. And Merren would finally be able to rest, Merren followed Sutton and Ransom for 2 days, watching as they pushed deeper into country that would kill them if she didn't. They were moving on stubbornness alone now, their supplies nearly exhausted, their horses stumbling with fatigue. Ransom was in particularly bad shape. He'd developed a cough that rattled in his chest, and his face had taken on a grey pallor that spoke of exhaustion beyond recovery. She could have taken them any time. They were barely keeping watch, too tired to maintain vigilance. But something held her back, a need to understand rather than simply to kill. Why were they still out here? What drove Sutton to continue when any sane man would have turned back? The answer came on the 3rd day, when she found Sutton's camp while he and Ransom slept. She'd been watching from a distance when she noticed something, a leather satchel that Sutton kept separate from his other gear, something he checked obsessively whenever they stopped, moving with extreme care. She entered the camp while they slept and opened the satchel. Inside were papers, letters, documents, things that made no sense in a hunting expedition. She took them back into the darkness and read by moonlight, and what she discovered made her reassess everything she'd thought she understood. The first document was a letter from Greer to Sutton, dated 2 months before the hunting party had formed. In it, Greer explained that certain members of the original group who'd burned the Cade homestead had become liabilities. Men who drank too much, talked too much, might eventually say the wrong thing to the wrong person. The letter continued. The Mountain Woman legend provides an opportunity. Organize a hunting party. Include Cobb, Kelly, Sam, Pike, and Deacon. If they happen to disappear in the mountains, well, that's what happens when you hunt dangerous prey. No more loose ends, no more risks. You and your most trusted men bring back confirmation that the woman is dead. Doesn't matter if she really is or not. And we're clear of this problem forever. Merren read it twice, then 3 times, her mind struggling to process what it meant. Greer hadn't sent these men to hunt her. He'd sent them to die. The men who'd murdered her family were being eliminated by the very man who'd ordered their deaths, and she was the weapon he was using to do it. A second letter made it even clearer. This one was addressed to a lawyer in Cheyenne, dated 3 weeks before the hunt began. In it, Greer outlined his concerns about certain former employees who possessed knowledge of past activities. That could prove embarrassing. He wrote about the need to resolve these matters permanently before they become problematic. There were more documents. A list of the 10 men with notations beside each name. 5 were marked primary targets. Those 5 were exactly the men who'd done the actual killing at her homestead. The other 5, including Sutton, were marked escorts, men Greer trusted to ensure the job got done. The final document was the most damning, a contract between Greer and a man named Hoyt, dated to begin the day after the hunting party was supposed to return. The contract hired Hoyt to verify the deaths of all parties involved in the mountain expedition and provide testimony that they were killed by the mountain woman. It was all planned out. Send 10 men into the mountains. Let the mountain woman, real or imagined, kill some of them. Have Sutton and his trusted men kill the rest and make it look like her work. Return with a story of a deadly hunt and tragic losses. Collect insurance money Greer had taken out on several of the men. Eliminate witnesses to past crimes. Close the book on the whole sordid affair. Merren sat in the darkness, holding these papers, feeling something shift fundamentally in her understanding of the situation. For 3 years, she'd been focused on justice for her family, on making the men who'd killed them pay. She thought she was in control of this hunt, that she was the one making decisions and taking action. But Greer had been playing a deeper game all along. He'd manipulated everyone, her, his own men, even Sutton, into doing exactly what he wanted. She thought she was the hunter, but she'd been a tool, a weapon Greer was wielding from a distance. The realization burned like acid. These men deserved to die for what they'd done, yes, but dying as part of Greer's plan, helping him clean up his own mess, letting him walk away clean while everyone else paid the price. That wasn't justice. That was just being used. She looked back at the camp where Sutton and Ransom slept, and her feelings about them became more complicated. Sutton was a murderer, yes. His hands were as bloody as anyone's. But he was also being betrayed by the man he'd served loyally for years. Ransom, who'd helped burn her family alive, was dying by degrees in these mountains, and Greer had planned for that death from the beginning. What did justice look like now? She'd killed 3 men who deserved killing, men who'd murdered her children. But continuing to kill was just doing Greer's work for him. Every death she caused was one less witness he had to worry about, one more piece of evidence he could use to support his mountain woman's story. She sat until dawn, thinking through the implications, and by the time the sun rose, she'd made a decision. The 5 men who'd split off, Pike, Deacon, Bowman, and the Harris brothers, she would let them go. They were marked for death anyway, and their survival would complicate Greer's plan. Let them get back to town. Let them tell their stories. Let them be the witnesses Greer thought he'd eliminated. But Sutton and Ransom, they were different. Sutton had known the truth all along. He'd helped Greer plan this betrayal, had led these men into the mountains, knowing some of them were meant to die. That made him more than just a killer. That made him complicit in something beyond simple murder. When Sutton woke and discovered the satchel open and the documents missing, his reaction told Merren everything she needed to know. He cursed savagely and immediately checked his rifle, his eyes scanning the forest with new understanding. He knew she'd read the letters. He knew the game had changed. "She's got the papers," he said to Ransom, who was coughing worse than ever. "She knows." "Knows what?" Ransom asked through his coughs. "Everything. What Greer planned. What we're really doing out here." Sutton's face was hard, calculating. "We need to find her today. If she makes it back to town with those documents, Greer's finished. And we're finished with him, so that was it." Sutton hadn't been continuing the hunt out of pride or stubbornness. He'd been trying to eliminate the evidence, both the mountain woman and any witnesses who might contradict Greer's planned narrative. Now that evidence included papers that could destroy Greer completely. Merren watched from her hiding place as Sutton tried to rally Ransom, but the other man was barely functional. The altitude, the exhaustion, the fear, it had all combined to break him physically. He was coughing blood now, and his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his rifle. "I can't," Ransom said. "I need to rest." You need to move," Sutton interrupted. "She's out there right now, probably watching us. We find her today, or we're both dead." They broke camp and started moving, but Ransom lasted less than an hour before he collapsed. Sutton tried to get him back on his horse, but the man was done. He sat slumped against a tree, coughing and shaking, barely conscious. Sutton stood over him for a long moment, and Merren saw the calculation in his eyes. Ransom was dead weight now, a liability. And Sutton had shown already what he did with liabilities. He raised his rifle, pointing it at Ransom's head. "Sorry, friend," he said. "But I can't have you slowing me down." Merren moved before she'd consciously decided to move. She stepped out from the tree line, her own rifle raised, pointed at Sutton. "Lower it," she said. Her voice was rough from 3 years of disuse, strange even to her own ears. Sutton spun toward her, his rifle swinging around, and for a frozen moment they faced each other across 30 feet of forest floor. "The mountain woman," Sutton said, and something like respect entered his voice. "You're real after all." "I'm real," Merren confirmed. "Lower your rifle." "Why?" "So you can kill me instead." "I don't think so." But he didn't shoot. He was too smart for that. If he killed her, Greer's plan worked perfectly. If she killed him, Greer still won. They were at an impasse, and they both knew it. "I've got Greer's letters," Merren said. "I know what he planned." "I know you were supposed to kill these men and blame me for it." Sutton's jaw tightened. "Smart woman. So what now? You going to shoot me, or are we going to talk?" "We're going to talk." "Because I think we both want the same thing now." "What's that?" "To make sure Dalton Greer pays for what he's done." Sutton laughed, a bitter sound. "You think you can touch Greer? He's got money, lawyers, judges in his pocket. Those papers might make trouble for him, but they won't put him in jail. Men like Greer don't go to jail." "Maybe not," Merren said. "But men like him can lose everything else. His reputation, his business, his freedom to act without consequences. That's better than him walking away clean, which is what happens if I kill you and finish his plan for him." She could see Sutton thinking it through, weighing his options. He was a pragmatist. He'd survived this long by understanding when to fight and when to negotiate. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "You and Ransom leave. Head back to town. When you get there, you tell the truth about what happened up here. You testify about Greer's plan. And you give me time to make sure certain other people survive to testify too. You're letting us go?" Sutton couldn't hide his disbelief. "I'm letting Ransom go. You're going to help me make sure justice actually happens. You're going to be my witness, Sutton. You're going to make sure Greer pays for killing my family. And if I refuse, then I shoot you right now, take the papers back to town myself, and hope it's enough to hang him. But we both know testimony from a dead woman's ghost isn't worth much in court. Testimony from Greer's own foreman, though, that's different." Sutton stood silent for a long moment, his rifle still pointed in her general direction. Then slowly he lowered it. "You're something else, lady. 3 years alone up here, and you're still thinking like a lawyer instead of a killer." "I'm thinking like a mother," Merren said quietly. "A mother who wants her children's deaths to mean something more than just feeding Dalton Greer's ambitions." She kept her rifle trained on him as Ransom gradually came back to awareness. She watched as Sutton explained the situation to him, saw the relief and confusion in the dying man's eyes. Then she pointed them south toward town, toward civilization, toward the justice she hoped still existed somewhere beneath all the corruption. "I'll know if you don't follow through," she called after them as they started to leave. "I'll be watching. And if Greer walks away from this, I'll come for him myself. And then I'll come for you." Sutton looked back at her, and for the first time she saw something like fear in his eyes. Not fear of dying, but fear of what she represented. A force that couldn't be bought or intimidated or reasoned with, that would pursue justice beyond death if necessary. "I believe you," he said simply, and led Ransom away into the trees. Merren watched them go, then looked down at the papers in her hand. The game had changed, the rules had shifted. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a path to something that looked like real justice. She had to find the other 5 men, Pike and the others who'd split off days ago. She had to make sure they survived to tell their stories. And she had to prepare for what came next, because Dalton Greer thought he'd covered all his bases, thought he'd manipulated everyone perfectly. But he'd made one critical mistake he'd underestimated. What a mother would do to protect her children's memory, and that mistake was going to cost him everything. Finding the 5 men who'd split off from Sutton took Merren a day, and a half of hard tracking. They'd made good progress initially, driven by fear and the desperate need to escape the mountains. But exhaustion and poor navigation had led them into rough country, and by the time she caught up to them, they were lost again. Moving in circles through a maze of identical ridges and valleys, she watched them from a distance, debating how to approach. These were still dangerous men, still armed, still capable of killing her if they got the chance. But they were also broken men, hollow-eyed and stumbling, more ghost than human. Pike could barely walk straight. Bowman had given up trying to navigate and simply followed wherever the others led. The Harris brothers argued constantly, their voices hoarse from days of shouting at each other. Only Deacon seemed to retain any composure, and even he looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 2 weeks. She decided on a direct approach. As dusk fell and they made camp in a small clearing, she walked out of the tree line with her rifle slung over her shoulder, her hands visible and empty of weapons. They saw her immediately, and their reaction was pure panic, scrambling for rifles, shouting warnings, complete chaos. "Don't shoot!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Like hell you're not!" Pike screamed, his rifle shaking as he pointed it at her. "You killed 3 of our men." 3 men who killed my family," Merren said, stepping closer but still maintaining distance. 3 men who murdered my husband and my children and burned them alive. But I'm not here for revenge anymore. I'm here because we both need something from each other. We don't need anything from you except for you to be dead, one of the Harris brothers said. But his voice lacked conviction. "You need to get out of these mountains alive," Merren said. "And you need a way to make sure Dalton Greer doesn't kill you for failing to bring back my body. I can help with both of those things." That got their attention. She saw recognition in their eyes, the understanding that they were in as much danger from Greer as they'd ever been from her. "How do you figure that?" Deacon asked carefully. "Because I know what Greer planned," Merren said, and she pulled the documents from her coat. "I know he sent you up here to die. I know some of you were supposed to disappear, convenient victims of the mountain woman. I know he took out insurance policies on several of you and planned to collect them. And I know that the only thing keeping you alive right now is being able to testify about what he did." She threw the papers toward them, letting them flutter to the ground, halfway between her position and theirs. "Read them. Then decide if you want my help or if you want to take your chances getting out of here alone and explaining to Greer why you're still breathing." Deacon, the bravest or most curious of them, edged forward and picked up the papers. He read by the light of their small fire, his face growing darker with each page. Then he passed them to the others, and she watched as the full scope of Greer's betrayal settled over them. "He was going to kill us," Pike said, his voice hollow. "We worked for him for years, and he was going to kill us." "He was going to have you killed," Merren corrected. "By me mostly, with some help from Sutton cleaning up any loose ends. You were never supposed to come back from this hunt. Sutton knew." This from Bowman, and his voice held a note of betrayal that went beyond the professional. Sutton was in charge of the operation. He was supposed to make sure the right people died and the right people lived. But things didn't go according to plan, and now we have an opportunity. "What opportunity?" Deacon asked. "To make sure Greer pays for what he's done, not just to my family but to all of us. But it requires you getting back to town alive and telling the truth about what happened up here." They looked at each other. These 5 men who'd come to hunt her and found themselves hunted instead. She could see them weighing their options, calculating odds, trying to decide if they could trust her. "Why should we believe you won't kill us the second we put down our rifles?" one of the Harris brothers asked. "Because if I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already," Merren said flatly. "I've been watching you for 2 days. I've had a dozen opportunities to shoot any of you. The only reason you're still alive is because I need you alive. To testify against Greer," Deacon said, understanding dawning. "To testify against Greer," Merren confirmed. "Sutton and Ransom are already on their way back to town. They'll tell their part of the story, but it needs to be corroborated by others. It needs to be overwhelming and undeniable. 5 of you plus Sutton, plus these documents, that's enough to bring him down. What about the men who died?" Pike asked. "What about Cobb and Kelly and Sam?" Merren's face went hard. "They died for what they did to my family. They murdered children. That debt is paid. But the man who ordered those deaths, who profited from them, who then tried to kill you to cover up his crimes, he's still walking free. That's not justice." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. These men had come hunting her, had participated in destroying her life, but they were also victims of Greer's manipulation. They were both perpetrators and pawns, and Merren needed them to be witnesses. Finally, Deacon spoke. "What do you need from us?" "I need you to get back to town safely. I need you to go straight to the territorial marshal, not Sheriff Talmadge. He's in Greer's pocket. I need you to testify honestly about everything that happened, including what you did to my family 3 years ago. That'll put us in jail," Bowman said. "Maybe, probably, but it'll put Greer there too, and that's worth something. Besides, dead men don't have the option of redemption. Living men do." It was a calculated statement, appealing to whatever shred of conscience they might have left. She saw it land differently with each of them. Pike looked sick. Bowman looked resigned. Deacon looked almost relieved, as if he'd been carrying the weight of what they'd done, and finally saw a way to set it down. "How do we know you won't follow us out and kill us on the trail?" Pike asked. "You don't," Merren said simply. "You're going to have to trust me, the same way I'm trusting you to actually testify instead of running. We're both taking risks here." More silence. Then Deacon made the decision for all of them. All right. Show us the way out of these mountains, and we'll testify. All of it, what we did, what Greer ordered, what happened up here. All of it, Merren nodded. Put your rifles down. I'm going to come into your camp, and we're going to talk about the route back to town. Anyone tries anything stupid, and the deal's off. Understood? They understood. One by one, they lowered their weapons, and Merren walked into their camp the first time she'd been among other human beings in 3 years. It felt strange and uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit anymore. But it was necessary. She spent that evening explaining the route they'd need to take, drawing maps in the dirt with a stick, pointing out landmarks they could use for navigation. She told them where to find water, which passes were safe, how to avoid the roughest terrain. She gave them some of her own supplies, dried meat and cornmeal she could spare, to supplement their depleted stores. As they talked, she learned more about them as individuals, rather than as the faceless group that had killed her family. Pike had a wife and 3 children back in town. Bowman was sending money back to his mother in Kansas. The Harris brothers were trying to save enough to start their own ranch. Deacon had a daughter who was about to get married. They were human beings with lives and families and dreams, just like she'd been. Just like Owen and Lily and Thomas had been. The realization didn't make her forgive them for what they'd done, but it complicated her rage, made it harder to see them as simple monsters deserving of death. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally as the fire burned low. "Why did you agree to burn out my family?" Silence, then Deacon answered. "Greer paid well, and he made it sound necessary. Said your husband was making trouble, threatening to go to the territorial government, going to cause problems for everyone. He said it needed to look like an accident so there wouldn't be questions. Did you know my children would be there?" Merren's voice was steady, but barely. More silence, longer this time. "We knew," Pike said finally, his voice barely audible. "We knew, and we did it anyway because Greer said it had to be done. There's no excuse for it, no way to make it right. We did a terrible thing for money, and we've got to live with that." "You get to live," Merren said. "My children don't." "No, ma'am, they don't, and that's on us. That's on us forever." She left them before dawn, slipping away while they slept, though she stayed close enough to shadow them for the next 2 days as they made their way toward lower elevations. She wanted to make sure they actually headed for town and didn't get any ideas about disappearing or changing their stories. But they held to their course, moving with renewed purpose now that they had a clear destination. On the 3rd day, when she was certain they were on track to reach Bridges Fork, she turned back toward the high country. She had one more task to complete before this was over. The skull ring, the tableau she'd been planning without fully knowing she was planning it, needed to be constructed. The bodies of Cobb, Kelly, and Sam needed to be recovered, and their remains prepared as testimony, physical, undeniable proof of what had happened in these mountains. It was gruesome work that would haunt her, but it was necessary. The theater of it mattered. When Hoyt or some other trapper stumbled upon the clearing she had in mind, when they saw 10 skulls arranged in a perfect circle with 10 rifles laid out like offerings, when they saw her sitting calm in the center eating cornbread as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that image would burn itself into the collective consciousness of everyone who heard about it. That image would make the story real in a way that testimony alone could not. It would transform her from ghost story to flesh and blood proof that justice, however terrible and strange, could still come to those who thought themselves above it. She worked for 5 days, moving the bodies to her chosen clearing, preparing them according to the task's requirements, arranging everything exactly as it needed to be. It was brutal, difficult work that left her hollow and sick, but she persisted. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the last act of a drama that had begun with smoke rising from her burning home 3 years before. When she was finished, when the ring was complete and perfect, she sat down in the center, exactly where she knew she'd be sitting when someone found her. She pulled out cornbread she'd baked specifically for this moment, because the detail mattered. because she wanted them to see her as human and ordinary, doing something as mundane as eating breakfast in the middle of a circle of death. She waited. She knew Sutton and Ransom would have reached town by now. She knew Pike and the others should arrive within a day or two. She knew that someone, probably Greer, trying to understand what had happened to his carefully laid plans, would send someone into the mountains to investigate. That someone would be Hoyt, the trapper, according to Greer's documents. He'd been contracted to verify deaths and provide testimony. He'd be coming soon. Merren sat in her circle eating her cornbread, waiting for the moment when 3 years of grief and rage and careful planning would finally crystallize into a single, perfect image that would define justice in the high country. She was ready for whatever came next. She'd done everything she could do. The rest was up to the law and to the people of Bridges Fork, and to whatever sense of right and wrong still existed in the world beyond these mountains. The wait wouldn't be long. She could feel it in the way the air had changed, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. The end was coming, and she would be ready to meet it. Hoyt arrived on the morning of the 6th day, just as Merren had anticipated. She heard him coming from half a mile away, his horse picking its way carefully through the forest, his occasional muttered curses when branches caught at his clothes. He was alone, which confirmed what the documents had suggested. Greer wanted a witness he could control, not a group that might develop their own narrative. Merren stayed exactly where she was, sitting cross-legged in the center of the skull ring, finishing the last of her cornbread. She'd positioned herself to face the direction Hoyt would approach from, had arranged her body language to appear calm and unthreatening, despite the macabre display surrounding her. The morning mist was still rising from the ground, creating exactly the atmosphere she'd hoped for, something otherworldly, something that would burn into Hoyt's memory and make his eventual testimony impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. She heard the moment Hoyt saw the clearing. His horse stopped abruptly, snorting nervously. There was a long silence, then the sound of him dismounting, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thump. His breathing had changed, quick and shallow. The sound of a man confronting something his mind couldn't quite process. He stepped into the clearing slowly, his hand on the pistol at his hip but not drawing it. His eyes went first to the skulls, arranged in their perfect circle, then to the rifles laid out with such deliberate care, then finally to her, sitting calm as Sunday morning, eating cornbread as if she did this every day. "Sweet Jesus," Hoyt whispered, and his face had gone pale under his weathered tan. Merren took another bite of cornbread, chewed slowly, swallowed. She let the silence stretch, let him take in every detail of the scene. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and conversational, which somehow made the whole tableau even more unsettling. "You must be Hoyt," she said. "Dalton Greer sent you to verify some deaths, I expect." Hoyt's hand tightened on his pistol, but he didn't draw it. "You're her, the mountain woman. Merren Cade. I was Merren Cade once. Now I'm not sure what I am. But yes, I'm the woman these men came to hunt." She gestured at the skulls around her. "They didn't succeed. You killed 10 men, Hoyt said, and his voice shook slightly. "I killed 3, Merren corrected. "The men whose skulls you're looking at. 3 men who murdered my family 3 years ago, burned my husband and children alive over a land dispute. The other 7 are alive and heading back to town as we speak. If they haven't arrived already." She could see Hoyt trying to process this information, trying to reconcile it with whatever instructions Greer had given him. Greer said a lot of things that weren't true," Merren interrupted. "He sent 10 men into these mountains, but not to hunt me. He sent them to die. 5 of them were witnesses to crimes he wanted eliminated. The other 5 were supposed to make sure those deaths happened and looked like my work. It's all in the documents I recovered from Sutton." She pulled the papers from inside her coat and held them up. "Greer's letters, his plans, his contracts, everything you need to understand what really happened here. You were supposed to be the final witness, the one who'd swear that all 10 men died at my hands. That would have made Greer's story complete and removed any inconvenient witnesses to his past crimes." Hoyt stared at the papers, then at her, then at the skull ring. "I don't understand. You were being used just like everyone else. But I'm giving you a choice now. You can tell Greer's lies and help a murderer cover his tracks, or you can tell the truth and help bring him to justice. What you tell people you saw here today will matter, Mr. Hoyt. It will matter more than you know. What do you want me to say?" His voice was barely a whisper. "The truth. That you found 3 skulls arranged in a circle, the remains of 3 men who burned my family alive. That you found me here, alive and sane, and willing to testify about what happened. That 7 other men survived and are already telling their stories in town. That Dalton Greer orchestrated all of this to cover his own crimes." She stood slowly, making no threatening moves, and walked to the edge of the circle. She held out the papers to Hoyt. "Take these to the territorial marshal, not to Sheriff Talmadge. He's in Greer's pocket." The territorial marshal. His name is Harlan Cross, and his office is in Cheyenne. These documents, plus the testimony of Sutton and the others, plus my testimony if they'll accept it, that's enough to bring Greer to trial. Hoyt took the papers with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked at them, then at her again. "Why are you doing this? You could have killed me too. You could have disappeared into these mountains, and no one would ever find you. Because killing solves nothing," Merren said quietly. "I killed 3 men, and it didn't bring my family back. It didn't ease the grief. It only added more weight to carry. What I want now is something different. I want the man responsible for all of this to face consequences. I want justice through law, not through revenge." "They might not believe any of this," Hoyt said. "Greer's powerful. He's got friends in high places. Maybe, but truth has a weight of its own, and there's a lot of truth here. Enough to make a difference, I think." She walked back to the center of the circle and sat down again, resuming her cross-legged position. "Go on now. Ride back to town and tell them what you saw. Tell them Merren Cade is alive and willing to testify. Tell them the mountain woman they've been whispering about for 3 years is ready to come down and face whatever judgment waits for her, as long as Dalton Greer faces his. Judgment too." Hoyt stood there for another long moment, looking at her sitting calm in the center of her circle of death. Then he nodded slowly, folded the papers carefully, and put them inside his coat. "I'll tell them," he said. "I'll tell them exactly what I saw and what you said. I can't promise what'll come of it, but I'll tell them. That's all I ask." She watched him mount his horse and ride away, watched until he disappeared into the trees and the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing. Then she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd just done. She'd committed herself to facing civilization again, to stepping out of the wilderness that had been her refuge and her fortress for 3 years. She'd committed herself to testifying, to reliving the worst day of her life in front of strangers, to trusting a legal system that had failed her once already, but it was the right choice. The only choice that honored what her family had been and what she'd once been, a woman who believed in justice and law, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. The sun was higher now, burning off the mist, revealing the clearing in harsh daylight. The skull ring looked different without the atmospheric fog, more stark, more brutal, more honestly terrible. She'd created this display as theater, as a message, but sitting here now she felt the full weight of what it represented. 3 men had died by her hand. That was a fact she'd have to live with forever. Justified or not, necessary or not, those deaths had changed her in ways she couldn't fully understand yet. She'd crossed a line that most people never crossed, had taken lives in the name of justice and grief and the simple need to survive. But she hadn't become a monster. She'd kept her humanity even in the darkest moments. She'd made choices based on principle rather than pure rage. And now she was choosing to trust in law and community and the possibility that truth might actually matter. It would take time for Hoyt to reach town, more time for his story to spread, more time for Marshal Cross to investigate and decide whether to take action. Days, probably, maybe weeks. She'd wait here in this clearing that had become both testament and warning, and she'd be ready when they came for her, because they would come. That much was certain. Whether they came to arrest her or to listen to her testimony, whether they came with warrants or with understanding, they would come, and she would face whatever came with the same calm determination that had kept her alive through 3 years of solitude and loss. She finished the last of her cornbread, brushed the crumbs from her hands, and settled in to wait. The skulls gazed at her with empty sockets, and the rifles lay silent on the ground. And overhead a hawk circled in the blue autumn sky. The mountains waited with her, patient and impassive as they'd always been. And somewhere down below, in the town that had failed her family, the wheels of justice, slow and imperfect but still turning, began to move. They came 4 days later, not with warrants and suspicion as Merren had half expected, but with something closer to respect. Marshal Harlan Cross led them, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize truth when it presented itself. He brought 3 deputies and, surprisingly, 2 of the territorial judges from Cheyenne. Merren heard them coming long before they arrived at the clearing. She'd stayed exactly where Hoyt had found her, maintaining the tableau, knowing that its power lay partly in its stillness and its terrible patience. When they emerged from the tree line, she was sitting cross-legged in the center of the skull ring, her hands folded in her lap, looking for all the world like a woman at meditation, rather than surrounded by death. Marshal Cross stopped at the edge of the clearing, his hand raised to halt his companions. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd investigated countless crimes. And she saw the moment he understood that this wasn't random violence or madness. This was deliberate. "Purposeful, meaningful, Mrs. Cade," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "I'm Marshal Harlan Cross. I've read the documents Mr. Hoyt brought me, and I've spoken with the men who returned from the mountains. I'm here to hear your testimony and to understand what happened here." Merren stood slowly, brushing dirt from her worn trousers. "Marshal Cross, thank you for coming. I wasn't certain anyone would. The evidence was compelling," Cross said. "And the testimony of 7 men who all told the same story. That's hard to ignore, even when the story is as strange as this one." He gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen are Judge Millison and Judge Hawthorne. They've agreed to hear preliminary testimony today, given the unusual circumstances. What you tell us here may determine whether formal charges are brought and against whom." "Against me, you mean," Merren said, "for killing 3 men. Among other considerations, yes," she nodded. "I understand, and I'm prepared to testify fully and honestly about everything that happened, from the day my family was murdered to this moment. But first, I need your assurance that Dalton Greer will also face justice for what he's done." "That's not how it works, Mrs. Cade," Judge Millison said, stepping forward. He was younger than Cross, with a careful lawyer's way of speaking. "We can't promise outcomes. What we can promise is a fair hearing and impartial investigation. With respect, Your Honor, impartial investigation failed me once. My family was burned alive, and Sheriff Talmadge ruled it an accident after 1 day of looking into it. Greer walked away clean, and I became a ghost." "Sheriff Talmadge is under investigation himself," Cross interjected, "based on testimony from Sutton and the others about his complicity in covering up crimes. You're right that the system failed you 3 years ago. We're here to try to correct that failure now." Merren studied their faces, looking for deception or political calculation, but found only weariness and a genuine desire to understand. These weren't corrupt officials or men in Greer's pocket. They were simply people trying to do their jobs in a hard country where justice was often complicated and incomplete. "All right," she said finally. "Where do you want me to start?" They spent the next 3 hours in that clearing, with Merren telling her story from beginning to end. She described her life before the fire, the land dispute with Greer, the day she returned to find her family dead. She talked about the 3 years in the wilderness, about watching and learning, about the psychological warfare she'd waged against men who'd thought themselves hunters. She explained her discovery of Greer's documents, the revelation that the hunting party had been a setup, her decision to let most of the men live and testify. She talked about the 3 men she'd killed, Cobb, Kelly, and Sam, and why she'd chosen them specifically. She described creating the skull ring, the theatrical display meant to ensure that what happened here would be remembered and would matter. Throughout it all, Cross and the judges listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, asking questions only when they needed clarification. The deputies stood guard at the clearing's edges, respectful and quiet, bearing witness to testimony that would become part of legal record and local legend in equal measure. When she finished, Judge Hawthorne, an older man who'd been silent until now, spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Cade, you've admitted to 3 killings. Under territorial law, that constitutes murder unless we determine it was justified self-defense or lawful execution of justice where legal remedies had failed." "I understand," Merren said. "You've also demonstrated considerable restraint," he continued. "You could have killed all 10 men. Many would argue you had justification to do so. Instead, you killed only those directly responsible for your family's deaths and allowed the others to live and testify. That shows remarkable judgment under extraordinary circumstances. It shows she understood the difference between revenge and justice," Judge Millison added, "which is more than many people manage even without the trauma she suffered." Marshal Cross stepped forward. "Mrs. Cade, I'm going to ask you to come with us back to Cheyenne. Not under arrest, but as a protected witness. We're bringing charges against Dalton Greer for conspiracy to commit murder, for the deaths of your family, and for his attempt to eliminate witnesses through this hunting expedition. Your testimony will be crucial to prosecuting those charges." "What about charges against me?" Merren asked directly. "That'll be determined after we hear all the testimony and review all the evidence," Cross said. "But speaking personally, and off the record, I think you have a strong argument for justifiable homicide given the circumstances. 3 years you waited, Mrs. Cade. 3 years you could have killed Greer himself, or burned down his ranch, or done any number of things that rage might justify. Instead, you gathered evidence, you preserved witnesses, and you found a way to bring about legal justice. That counts for something." Merren felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight for 3 years. It wasn't absolution, she didn't expect or deserve that, but it was acknowledgement. These men understood what she'd done and why, even if they couldn't officially approve of it. "I'll come with you," she said. "But I need to do something first." She walked to where she'd left her pack, removed Owen's pocket watch, and carried it to the edge of the clearing. There was a cairn of stones she'd built there, marking the direction of her family's graves miles away. "This belongs with them," she said quietly, placing the watch on top of the cairn. "I carried it long enough. It's time to let it rest." She stood there for a moment, her head bowed, speaking words only she could hear. Then she turned back to the waiting men and nodded. "I'm ready." As they prepared to leave the clearing, Marshal Cross paused beside the skull ring. "What should we do with these remains?" "Bury them," Merren said. "They were men once, whatever they became. They deserve that much." "And the rifles?" "Evidence," she said. "For the trial. Let them speak for what happened here." They collected the rifles, marked the location of the remains for proper burial detail, and began the journey down from the high country. Merren walked among them. No longer a ghost or a legend, but simply a woman who'd survived impossible loss and found her way back to something resembling human community. The mountains watched them go, impassive and eternal, keeping their secrets and their stories the way they always had. The trial of Dalton Greer lasted 3 weeks and became the most talked-about legal proceeding in territorial history. The courtroom in Cheyenne was packed every day with spectators who'd traveled from across Wyoming and beyond to witness what newspapers were calling the Mountain Woman's justice. Merren testified on the 4th day, speaking clearly and calmly about events that would have broken most people to recount. She described finding her family's bodies, the sheriff's refusal to investigate, the 3 years of survival in the wilderness. She presented Greer's documents as evidence, explained their significance, and withstood 2 days of cross-examination from Greer's expensive lawyers. Sutton testified after her. his voice flat and factual as he explained Greer's plan to eliminate witnesses and how the hunting expedition had been designed from the start to result in deaths that could be blamed on the mountain woman legend. Pike, Deacon, Bowman, and the Harris brothers all corroborated his account, each adding details that painted a picture of systematic manipulation and cold-blooded planning. Greer's defense tried to paint Merren as deranged, the other witnesses as unreliable, the documents as forgeries. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. 7 men, all telling the same story. Documents in Greer's own handwriting. The testimony of townspeople who'd seen the land grab happen, who'd known about the suspicious fires, who'd watched Sheriff Talmadge look the other way time and again. On the 21st day of the trial, the jury returned its verdict after 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all charges. Conspiracy to commit murder, ordering the deaths of the Cade family, attempting to eliminate witnesses. The judge sentenced Greer to 20 years in the territorial prison, and additional civil judgments stripped him of most of his land and assets. Sheriff Talmadge was charged separately as an accessory after the fact. He pled guilty and received 5 years to be served at a different facility than Greer. As for Merren herself, the Territorial Attorney General declined to prosecute her for the deaths of Cobb, Kelly, and Sam. In a written decision that would be cited in legal cases for decades afterward, he ruled that her actions constituted justifiable homicide under extraordinary circumstances where legal remedies had demonstrably failed and her own life remained in danger. Mrs. Cade spent 3 years attempting to find justice through legal means, the decision read. She gathered evidence, preserved witnesses, and ultimately delivered both to the proper authorities. That she also defended herself against men who'd murdered her family and were now hunting her in the wilderness. That cannot be construed as criminal behavior under any reasonable interpretation of territorial law. The decision wasn't unanimous. Some legal scholars and newspaper editors argued that she should have faced trial, that no one should be allowed to take 3 lives without formal legal judgment. But public sentiment ran heavily in her favor. The mountain woman had become a symbol of frontier justice, of what happened when the system failed and people had to protect themselves. In late October, 6 months after the trial ended, Merren returned to the mountains, not to hide or to disappear, but to visit the graves of her family one final time before making a decision about her future. She stood on the ridge above where the cabin had been, looking down at the burned timbers that were slowly being reclaimed by forest. Someone, she never learned who, had erected a new marker on the graves, with all 4 names carved carefully into weathered wood: Owen Cade, Lily Cade, Thomas Cade, below her own name. Someone had added words: beloved daughter of the high country, gone but not forgotten. She'd been dead for 3 years, buried in the minds and records of everyone who'd known her. Now she was alive again, but different, changed by loss and solitude and the hard choices survival had demanded. She would never be the woman she'd been, the wife and mother who'd baked bread and taught her children and dreamed of building something lasting in this hard country. But she could be someone new, someone who understood both the wilderness and civilization, who could move between them with equal competence, someone who carried grief but wasn't defined by it, who'd sought justice and found it, however imperfectly. The territorial governor had offered her a position as a wilderness guide and consultant, someone who could help locate people lost in the mountains and advise on matters of frontier law, where the line between civilization and wild country blurred. She'd accepted, recognizing that it gave her purpose beyond simply surviving, a way to honor her family's memory by helping others avoid similar tragedies. She would live in the high country still, but not as a ghost or a legend. She'd have a cabin near Bridges Fork, would come into town regularly, would participate in the community that had once failed her, but had ultimately found its way toward justice. The mountains would remain her home and her sanctuary. But they would no longer be her prison, as the sun set over the Bitterroot Range, painting the peaks gold and purple the way they'd been painted on countless evenings before. Merren knelt beside the graves and spoke aloud to the family she'd lost. "It's done," she said quietly. "Greer's in prison. Talmadge too. The men who killed you are either dead or have testified against the man who ordered it. Justice came finally. It's not perfect, and it doesn't bring you back, but it's something. It counts for something." She paused, listening to the wind move through the pines, carrying the sense of autumn and approaching winter. "I'm going to keep living," she continued. "Not just surviving, but actually living. Building something new, helping people, finding purpose. I think that's what you'd want for me. I think that's the only way to honor what we had together, by not letting grief destroy what's left of me." She placed wildflowers on each grave, late-season asters and goldenrod, the flowers that grew in the high meadows she'd come to know so well. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and looked out over the valley that had cost her everything and given her back something she hadn't expected: the strength to survive and the wisdom to seek justice rather than simply revenge. The legend of the mountain woman would persist, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Stories would be told around fires for generations about the woman who'd returned 10 skulls for 10 hunters, who'd become a spirit of the wilderness itself, who'd brought justice to a lawless land. The truth would blur into myth, as truth always did in country where the line between possible and impossible was never quite clear. But Merren knew the truth, and so did the mountains. She'd been a wife and mother, had lost everything, had survived through skill and determination, and had found a way to make her family's deaths matter. She'd been hunted and had become the hunter. She'd been dead and had come back to life. She'd been alone for 3 years and was now ready to rejoin the world. As darkness fell over the high country, Merren made her way down the ridge toward the trail that would take her back to town. Behind her, the graves rested quiet under their flowers. Above her, stars began to appear in the deepening blue, the same stars that had watched over her during 3 years of solitude. Now watching as she walked back toward humanity and purpose and the future she would build from the ruins of her past. She didn't look back. The dead were at peace, and the living had work to do. The mountains would always be there, patient and eternal, offering sanctuary to those who needed it and justice to those who deserved it. And Merren Cade, neither victim nor legend, but simply a woman who'd survived and found her way to truth, walked into her future with steady steps and clear eyes, carrying her grief, but no longer being carried by it. In the clearing where the skull ring had been, wind moved through empty space, rustling pine needles and carrying away the last traces of blood and fear. The forest reclaimed what had been temporarily marked by human drama, the way it always did. But the story remained, woven into the fabric of the territory, a reminder that justice could come from unexpected places and that some debts, however long delayed, would eventually be paid. The mountain woman had returned their skulls as her answer. And in doing so, she'd answered something larger, the question of what happens when the system fails and people have to find their own way toward truth. The answer wasn't always clean or legal or simple, but sometimes it was necessary. And sometimes, as in Merren Cade's case, it was enough.